In light of the recent events regarding the discovery of the mass grave at Kamloops Residential School, and more recently, the discovery of the 104 additional graves of children found in Manitoba, Lawyered has decided to conduct an interview series with professionals about why Indigenous issues should be highlighted and discussed not only in a legal perspective, but also why such matters should be made a priority when discussing health and much needed change in our society at large. Today, our first interview is with Kelly, who I'm going to give the floor to introduce herself, to speak a bit about her work, her Indigenous heritage, and experiences.
All right, thank you. Yes, and I'm Kelly Laurila, and I've been at Renison University, I guess, for about 12 years, mostly as a contract lecturer. And a lot of the courses that I teach are around Indigenous perspectives, and I want to acknowledge too that I am Indigenous. And I'm Indigenous Sami. So I grew up on Treaty 61 territory in Northern Ontario. But I recognize that my grandfather came from Northern Finland. So I'm also settler, and that really makes for conflicting identity, which is actually part of the policy politics of our government as well, about, pulling out hairs in terms of Indigenous identity. But it is important because I don't speak for Indigenous peoples in Turtle Island, but yet I have had probably close to almost 30 years of working with Indigenous elders in community and attending ceremony and hearing their thoughts. So that very much informs how I see the world. I see it from an Indigenous lens there.
That's amazing. Thank you for being here today to speak with me. It's great that we have someone who can offer such an insight, like in a unique lens, both Western and Indigenous. So you mentioned working with Indigenous communities for over 30 years, and you yourself have an Indigenous heritage. So I wanted to ask you, how important is an issue like this? Why is it so important to discuss it, bring it to light, and to highlight it?
So, in one hand, I also want to say, like, why is it a surprise to anyone that there are these Indigenous children's bodies being found? Because actually it's not new news, and yet I also know that it's also new for many Canadians. And so I think it's very worthy that we're talking about this circumstance. It's the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that's been going on for since at least 2015. But I'll tell you that those words were worded by Indigenous people since the 70s. So again, that's not new news. And I'll talk maybe a little bit later about why is it that Canadians haven't known about this. But I think about the evilness that church administrators would bury the bodies of Indigenous children on their properties of the residential schools. So then it makes me think about, why are the names of the children not known? And then I also think about, were the families contacted? And I probably will say, no, they weren't, because those bodies would have been brought home to the families and communities. And so this is really a grave atrocity in Canada, that this ever could have happened. I can say that if one Canadian child, maybe one white child, was ever gone missing, it would be on the Amber Alerts. And if their body was found, there would be a massive public outcry about the need for an investigation. And yet somehow the lives and the children of residential schools did not matter enough that people would have been outraged before 2021. And so what I think this means for Indigenous peoples is, it's atrocious for them, but it's a re-traumatization all over again. Residential schools were traumatic enough for survivors and their families and communities, but now realizing that, they're just discovering something. Is that my child that was there, if those parents are even alive? Was that my sister or brother? And so that's all being questioned. And so And just there was no ceremony for those children when their lives passed, which is very important for Indigenous peoples. And I think all people, when someone passes, we have ceremony. What I think this reflects for our society that is so important is it reflects racism. Policies were created, such as the residential schools, that there were no policies created for any other people in Canada. So that's racism, when you target a people because of specifically who they are. And it means that their lives are not valued. We don't value Indigenous lives. And I also made note, because in page 90 of the TRC final report, in 2015, I just want to kind of note this, that when they were putting together the findings for the TRC and the calls to actions, there actually is a call to action to create a national register of all of the children who went to residential schools, because it was acknowledged that we don't know the names of everyone who were in those schools. And so there's 3 categories of children. So a register of confirmed names and deaths, that we would expect. Then there's a register of confirmed deaths, but no names. And then there is the 3rd category of a register of deaths that require further investigation. So why did they die? And that's very problematic. So those, I think, are some really important reasons why we need to be concerned about the 215 children. On top of it, it's just a tragedy of such a loss. But I also know that there was over 4,700 children who died in those schools. And that alone is a genocide.
This situation is incredibly disheartening. And I know that you talked about reconciliation and the implications for settler peoples. And I wanted to elaborate on this before we further. Just what does reconciliation mean for those who don't know? And how do the health and legal sector intersect with it?
So reconciliation is really about creating justice in the relationships between Indigenous and settler peoples. I think Canadians might think that reconciliation's for Indigenous peoples, but it's not Indigenous peoples who have to reconcile anything, really. It's for settler peoples and the history they've inherited and the ongoing broken treaties that they've inherited and the injustices that actually settler society continues to perpetrate against Indigenous peoples. And part of that perpetration is because settler peoples have been trained to not think about their history with regard to Indigenous peoples. That's a colonial white supremacy kind of thinking there in our policies, right? That settler peoples haven't needed to know about a history that didn't concern them. So they've learned about a beautiful settler history of how Canada was settled by them and their ancestors. But it actually erased Indigenous peoples in there altogether.
What would you say is an appropriate response that should be taken by the health sector or the legal sector in response to these discoveries? Like, what recommendations would you give?
So, with regard to health and well-being, I actually just want to note something, and this is maybe common to a lot, maybe some people might know this, but in developing countries, there are 3 factors that are found to increase the health and well-being of a people, which means to decrease mortality rates. And that is clean water, all-weather housing, and sewage treatment processes. And those are largely not on reserves in Canada. So Canada really is in violation of basic human rights. All humans in this world are actually entitled to clean water, a hygienic sewage treatment system, and housing. And yet Canada doesn't provide that for Indigenous peoples on reserves. People might think that Indigenous people own their housing on reserves, and for the most part, that's largely not the case. It's government owned, In fact, those wouldn't have been the original territories of Indigenous peoples to begin with. And so something else maybe that's related to the justice system and how our land was settled in Canada is the doctrine of discovery. And I think it relates to what the justice system and lawyers and even judges can be working on. And it actually relates to healthcare in a sense, because the doctrine of discovery allowed settler peoples to lay claim to land because it was their God-given right to, so they could go out and discover land and claim it. And so with that, there's a sense of entitlement. And actually in 1823, in the United States was a case called Johnson versus McIntosh. And so that was part of the doctrine of discovery. And the decision there was that Indigenous people did not have rightful ownership of the land. And it was because of this doctrine. And so they possess land, but they don't own it. And so it's really atrocious to think that Indigenous people who've always been here have to go to the Supreme Court of Canada to get title to their own land. And there were some cases that were won, mostly in BC, but how this affects health and well-being is that there's no acknowledgement that Indigenous peoples have Indigenous rights to the way that they are provided health and well-being care. And so they face a lot of racism and discrimination in our healthcare system. And we know the case of Joyce Echaquan, who died in a hospital because of the racist actions of a nurse. And this is a case in Quebec. The inquiry just finished. And so the sad thing is that one of the recommendations was training for all of the health personnel in that hospital in Quebec, and less than 5% of the staff showed up for the training. So it really speaks to the ignorance, but also the discrimination and the racism against Indigenous people. So we know that Indigenous people are not experiencing the health care that they could be receiving in mainstream hospitals.
I know that you said, especially as Canadians, this reflects an act of racism. How can we, this is the last question, drive change, especially as students and law students specifically?
So I think, there's stuff that we can actually do right today. Any one of us, we're sitting in meetings all the time. Students are sitting in meetings. They're asked to participate in some university committee. And so with their knowledge about Indigenous history, they might be able to speak to policies and practices that are happening and that are not including the voices and needs of Indigenous people. And so there could be a question of, well, how will this be relevant to Indigenous people? Or have we checked out with the Indigenous student population to see how this could affect? And so I think wherever we're at, in any boards or whatever, if we had our minds sort of always thinking of raising the voices of Indigenous peoples who've largely been silenced in all sectors in society, in education, in health, government, justice system. And if we made a point of ensuring that there were Indigenous people at the table and that their voices are being heard. And it's not all about Indigenous people, but yet if they're not at the table, their perspectives are not being offered. And I think any one of us we come at things from our perspective and our lens. And so it actually takes people who have diverse identities at the table to help shape a more inclusive, a belonging kind of society in the university and the justice system, and thinking about how will this affect the Indigenous peoples. So that's probably the biggest takeaway for me, is us questioning the very policies and practices that we've considered normalized, and maybe critique those and think, what's absent here? Is this affecting Indigenous peoples and what can we do to raise up their voices at the tables.
Thank you so much for your time, Kelly. I learned a lot, and I'm sure anybody listening would say the same. You've been wonderful to talk to, and I really hope that this conversation sparks more conversations, especially within our organization, with relation to the issues that the Indigenous population faces on a regular basis. And if there's anything else that you'd like to add or encourage people to learn more about, what would you say?
Probably is, the way we learn about ourselves is through dialogue with people who are different from who we are. I can read all kinds of things, but it actually is in talking to people that I discover where my biases and where my assumptions are. And so it's really the beauty of the diversity that it can exist in Canada, that we end up learning more about ourselves, but we have to be open to it, I guess. That's the big thing.